Anyway, in a week of cleanups and reversals, the White House is now rejecting Russia, just for today, rejecting Vladimir Putin's offer to allow the United States investigators to question 12 Russians indicted for election meddling in exchange for the U.S. agreeing to let Moscow question some American officials, including former U.S. Ambassador to Russia Michael McFaul. The White House press secretary, Sarah Huckabee Sanders, put out a new statement yesterday saying, quote, "It is a proposal that was made in sincerity by President Putin." Made in sincerity? I think it was very cynical. But President Trump disagrees with it. Hopefully, President Putin will have the 12 identified Russians come to the United States to prove their innocence or guilt. But the statements claim that, quote, President Trump disagrees with it. That is in direct contrast to what Trump initially said, calling it an incredible offer, and Sanders saying that the White House was considering the proposal.
We would expect that the Americans would reciprocate and they would question officials, including the officers of law enforcement and intelligence services of the United States, whom we believe who have something to do with illegal actions on the territory of Russia.
What he did is an incredible offer. He offered to have the people working on the case come and work with their investigators with respect to the 12 people. I think that's an incredible offer.
The president's going to meet with his team, and we'll let you know when we have an announcement on that.
For a second, is that a topic that came up in their conversation? Did President Putin raise this with President Trump?
There was some conversation about it, but there wasn't a commitment made on behalf of the United States, and the president will work with his team, and we'll let you know if there's an announcement on that front.
You know, Katty Kay, let's really just strip this down and be honest about it. No American, unless they were a dupe for Vladimir Putin, would think that turning a former Russian ambassador over to Russian investigators, especially an ambassador who'd been kicked out of Russia because he spoke out too forcefully against Vladimir Putin's abuses, no red-blooded American would think that was an incredible offer. But Donald Trump did think it was an incredible offer. Sarah Huckabee Sanders said that he had to think about it a day later, and now we have this reversal yet again. I'm sure they'll change tomorrow, but what do you make of the back and forths on turning Americans over to Russians?
This was never going to happen. You were never going to turn over a former ambassador, a U.S.-born financier who'd helped implement the Magnitsky Act, a whole bunch of Senate staffers who had helped drawn up American law. These were all of the people that Putin wanted. And you have to wonder, what was President Trump thinking during the course of that 2-hour meeting? What was it Putin said to him? How did he communicate with him that seemed to win Donald Trump over, so that when he came out of that 2-hour meeting, his initial instinct, his gut reaction was to say, yeah, this is an incredible offer. I think this is a great idea. And I think as we head into the prospect, because one was not enough, why not have a second one, of that second Putin meeting, you've got intelligence officials now scrambling to find out what else Donald Trump may have agreed to. What did he give away? What were the verbal commitments? Because you've got Russian officials and President Putin saying, hey, it was great. We came out of Helsinki. We got these agreements. We're looking forward to working on them. And the head scratching going on around Washington, particularly in the defense community, saying, we have no idea. We don't know what our president may have just committed this country to, and now we have the prospect of a second meeting as well. It beggars belief. It's extraordinary.
And Jonathan Lemire, you were there. Tell me, all the back and forths that have been going on this week, what's your take? What have you heard inside the White House? What have you heard across Washington? Not only about the reaction a week later, or several days later, into this summit, but also the president lurching forward to have another summit with Vladimir Putin when he still hasn't cleaned up the multitude of messes created by the first summit.
Very few things seem to stick to this president. He seems to bounce off controversy nearly on a daily basis. A few things like Charlottesville, we still feel that one. This week seems like it could stay. And I think that part of the confusion is, and part of the reason why the stories and the questions are still circulating, is that no one knows really what happened. It's not just that we in the media don't entirely know what's happened. Key members of the United States government don't know what happened in Helsinki on Monday. The members of the White House themselves are still trying to figure out exactly what President Trump may have agreed to. We're relying on what the Russians are telling us. And I think there has been a lot of pushback from Republicans, mostly those who are not facing re-election this fall, who feel like this was a mistake, that the president has given too much. He's changed the party. We saw the reaction on Fox News, which we never see to something the president does. And this is, the president, though, is telling people that he wants to force
Jonathan,
forward.
Fox News, Jonathan, you had the New York Post being critical, talking about his see no evil diplomacy. You had the Wall Street Journal. Again, how remarkable that the Wall Street Journal said we need a containment policy. They're correct. Congress needs a containment policy not only for Vladimir Putin, but also for Donald Trump. You had a lot of very conservative voices coming out, being very critical of the president. And yet, here's the president, despite the fact it's not good for him politically, despite the fact it will hurt Republicans in the midterm, setting up yet another summit with Vladimir Putin.
And it fits a pattern here, right? With a few moments where we have seen this president never apologize, but sort of walk something back. The Access Hollywood tape and Charlottesville. And both times he issued some sort of statement that was a sort of a retreat. It felt like a hostage video. But he did it unwillingly, only to a day or two later double down again to his original position. And I think we're seeing that now, though he continues in his public statements sort of hem and haw as to what he said to Putin. But now we're seeing that, yes, he wants to forge forward with this summit. We're seeing it again.
Guys, there's a bigger picture here, Joe, and I think we have to focus on, I know we're going to talk about Dan Coates and his interview yesterday with Andrea Mitchell, but it's an extraordinary thing that happened yesterday. We had the DNI, the Director of National Intelligence, the guy who knows everything, yesterday told Andrea Mitchell essentially he still has no idea what happened in the meeting between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. That's an amazing thing that happened, and you can feel among a lot of serious people, a lot of Republicans who have been concerned about what's happening in this presidency, about what's happening between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin, about what Vladimir Putin might have in terms of compromising material or other kind of leverage against Donald Trump. This in and of itself is an astonishing thing that we learned yesterday. And then in the middle of the interview, the president comes out and issues a statement that says that he's inviting Vladimir Putin, despite all of the sound and fury of this last week, that he's inviting Vladimir Putin to come to Washington, D.C. It's a moment that we will remember, I think, historically, and it's kind of astonishing on a million levels. But I will say that apart from everything else, what we learned with that invitation is one of the things that happened in that meeting. One of the things that happened in that meeting is that Donald Trump, in secret not just from the press, but in secret from his own DNI and much of the rest of his government, made an agreement with Vladimir Putin to have Vladimir Putin come to Washington in the middle of a midterm election. And that speaks to the extraordinary leverage that Vladimir Putin has over Donald Trump. We still don't know exactly why, but it's an incredible thing.
Well, and it really doesn't matter why at this point. I mean, we'll find out why either through Robert Mueller or historians will find out why. But I can't even imagine, John, Republicans that are in swing districts that Hillary won, getting the news that Donald Trump is going to make a fool of himself again with Vladimir Putin, this time in the United States, and a lead up to a midterm election. Right. It's very suicide. Bad news for those.
Political suicide.
Yeah, political suicide. We got to go to break, but I'm just curious, really quickly, into the week. Looking back, we've talked about this, John, for quite some time. Republicans being too cowardly to stand up on the Hill for Donald Trump. Republicans in his administration biting their tongue when they should be speaking out. Is this, would you say this is a week at least attached to this one event? Maybe not. Maybe it won't happen to other events. But this was the 1 week that a good bit of the Republican and conservative leadership in Washington, D.C., thought leaders and political leaders did stand up and speak out against Donald Trump?
Well, certainly it's just empirically it was greater in number and there was more of it than we've ever seen before on almost anything else. I think it's even more than there was. Jonathan Lemire mentioned Charlottesville. That's the one outstanding example in the past. I think you saw more of it this week, and I think more than that, though. I think that the sight of DNI Coates yesterday. Making the comments that he made that now may have put his job in jeopardy. I'm sure we're going to get to that reporting later today. The way in which Christopher Wray made the comments that he made to Lester Holt out in Aspen, where they all, in various ways, are trying to signal that something is wrong here, and that what we've saw from Donald Trump in Helsinki and what we've seen in the aftermath of Helsinki suggests that something is not just wrong but deeply dangerous. I think you are starting to see some kind of shift in the tectonic plates in the way the government's dealing with Donald Trump, and in particular the way your former party is dealing with him. I think this may be a week that history remembers.
I think so, and good luck firing Dan Coates. If he thinks firing James Comey was a problem, good luck firing Dan Coates, a man who suggests that something's just not right with Donald Trump's relationship with Vladimir Putin. Lots of luck on that one, fella. Dan Coates, as we're talking about, his stunned reaction to the White House invite of Vladimir Putin was just one of several telling moments from the director of the National Intelligence. We're going to run through the others straight ahead on Morning Joe.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.